Well, firstly, thank you to all of you for being here, because when I addressed the Police Federation, when I was Home Secretary, the graveyard slot was 2 o'clock in the afternoon after a heavy lunch. The graveyard slot in education's always been around 4 o'clock, so thank you very much for being here. Thank you to David Mensah for all the work he's done, and it's because of him that I was blagged into coming this afternoon. I've been doing work with Andrew Percy, who was chairing earlier in the day, on the Charities Aid Foundation investigation into giving. So actually there's been a lot of cross-party work between Andrew Percy and myself. I also just want to say a word of thanks to Andrew Harrison. Andrew, if it weren't for you, and I know Sebastian from Dixon's has been working with you, none of this would have happened, and I think we owe you a debt of gratitude for the investment that you put in, the commitment and the staying power, because we all start things on occasions, but seeing them through is the art of the possible. I ought to confess to you all that when it comes to technology, I'm vehemently in favour and absolutely useless in doing it myself. A mouse is still something in the skirting board, an apple is a fruit, a tablet's a piece of medicine, and I'm married to a GP, so I get that all the time. And I just know that I've got to get to grips with it. I've got a computer which has a synthetic voice, and we access it using the keys as the cursor. But most days I would like to throw it out of the window. So what I'm going to say this afternoon is not do as I do, but do as I say instead, which you've heard from Secretaries of State over the years as well, have you not? Andrew mentioned that I am a trained teacher, and all those years ago, accessing information, being able to draw down on the body of knowledge and theory from the past was obviously a great deal more difficult than it is today, both for teachers and for students. And that's why I'm so enthusiastic about what is already a completely different landscape and is already showing major signs of being part of the drive for improved education. And I just want to say this afternoon that I think we've got the best heads and the best teachers that we've ever had in this country, and I'm very proud of what is taking place in the education field. And I think if you can hold your nerve as political change takes place around you, it is possible that we could pull off a further transformation, because it is changing and improving all the time over the next decade. I ought to also confess that getting technology right in government doesn't always work. The Department for Education and Employment, as it was in those days, knew that they were going to end up with me as Secretary of State, because it was pretty obvious we were going to win the election. We didn't know by how much. And Tony Blair had made it clear that he would make me the Secretary of State. So very kindly, they prepared for someone who couldn't see. They bought in special software. This was, remember, this is a fairly long time ago now. It makes me feel old. It's 16 years ago. And they brought in a Braille transcriber. And they gave me a folder with Braille in to take across to Downing Street very shortly after I'd arrived. And I got there and I opened it and I couldn't read a word of the Braille. And it didn't really matter, because I'd been doing the job in opposition for 2.5 years, and I ad-libbed, and Tony didn't notice that I'd ad-libbed. Actually, he never noticed when I was ad-libbing. But I did go back and say, I think we need to get this right, because I'll be chairing meetings and I'll need statistics, and sometimes my memory will let me down. Anyway, they shot off. About 20 minutes later, they came back. They said, Secretary of State, we found the problem. I said, what was it? They said, the Braille transcriber was brought from Sweden and it wasn't switched over. Now, if you know, understanding Swedish as a spoken language is one thing, Swedish Braille is entirely another. We also had in the new ministerial team, one of us who was computer savvy, Kim Howells, and he discovered on his desk a computer that had never actually been used, would you believe? So he opened it up, and that was the beginning of trying to get the department on board to use email, the early days of email, rather than faxing things and all kinds of modern technology that people had not heard of. So here we are this afternoon with the charity created with the opportunity of spreading both the word and the technology so that you can make it work. And I just wanted to say, the big mistake I made when I became Secretary of State was not about the resource, because we did, by 2001, we actually had put up quite a lot of money in comparative terms in those days, in terms of investment in technology. What we didn't do was to offer people sufficient training, both about what needed to be purchased and how to use it most effectively. And I think that was a mistake, because it may well have set us back a little in terms of making it work both for teachers and for students. For teachers, obviously, because TeachersNet and the ability to share practice, to draw down on programs of study and schemes, the ability not to have to reinvent the wheel is a wonderful thing. When I was in my first 2 years in teaching, I would have loved to have been able to plagiarize more effectively what was on offer. And facilitating that is obviously really important, and it still is. And the development of intranet between partner schools is critical. But actually then translating what you're able to draw down on into the best ways of using technology with students, not for them, but with them, is obviously going to be vital. And with families. Another issue on which, if I had my time again, I would have invested a great deal more money and effort, would have been the link between schools and homes. We all know that the commitment of family, the confidence of family, the ability of family to be part of a youngster's development is absolutely critical. We see that as to why Chinese youngsters do so well, Indian youngsters do so well, why there's been a transformation in areas of the country, like Tower Hamlets, in terms of achievement levels, because there's a commitment from teachers and head teachers, but there's a commitment for parents, not all of whom know anything about education, but are deeply interested. And in my own constituency, seeing that Michael Wilshare's mentioned it again over the last few days, we all know that white working class boys are really struggling. And it's a particular issue in the constituency that I represent. But they're the ones who might actually literally be switched on by switching on. Two of my older sons, I'm sure they wouldn't mind me telling you this, two of my older sons have very severe dyslexia. And we didn't discover, even though I got a PGCE and my wife was a teacher, my ex-wife was a teacher, it wasn't until my eldest son was into his early teens that we really identified what the problem was, by which time he'd become quite disaffected and his behaviour had deteriorated. He actually, in the end, got an MSc, so he's done all right, but it was touch and go. And I think that had we been able to use technology more effectively in the way that you've been describing and discussing all day, so I'm repeating things I'm sure that people have said ad nauseum, but had we been able to do that, and were we able to do it now for special educational needs more broadly, we can be transformational in what youngsters can actually do in overcoming challenges which you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. We can also, of course, develop the classroom of the future, because we used to talk about this, Professor Michael Barber and I used to talk about what will the classroom look like in 20 years. Well, actually, it has changed, but it hasn't changed quite so dramatically over those years as I'd expected, because we can now make the classroom part of the outreach, so that wherever a youngster is, we still need traditional classrooms. We need to talk to each other. We need teamwork. We need people who can converse rather than grunt. We need people who can actually read old-fashioned books. I'm very strongly in favour of still keeping the books. I just say that so that Michael Gove can't misinterpret what I'm saying this afternoon. I really love even dog-eared textbooks. I'd love, if I'd been able to browse through a library. But of course, virtually, people can browse through the Bodleian and will be able to in the future. So being able to access knowledge information, being able to learn how to make sense of it, being able to communicate in new ways, being able to connect across the world in terms of not just learning language, but learning culture, understanding geography better, actually being able to break down barriers. All of this is now with you and is happening. And tablets for schools can actually make that a reality for youngsters who don't have access to their own facilities. The ability for every child to be able to own, to care about, to value what they've got in their hand and to be able to take it home is really important. We had a little project in South Yorkshire some years ago using what was then European Objective 1 money. My great fear, I mean, I'd better just share this with you, my great fear about handing it out in parts of South Yorkshire was that it would be on the market stall on Saturday. So, you know, but you can overcome that now. Andrew Harrison assured me just before we came in, because we were talking about theft of mobile devices, and it was always a bit of a bind when I was Home Secretary, disabling things and actually being able to build in protections is not beyond the wit of man and woman, so we ought to be able to do it. It's also linked to that part of protecting children by educating them as to how to use, when to use, what to use, and when not to use devices. I'm slightly obsessed at the moment, and have been since I was Home Secretary, with cyber crime. I love the idea that Google and Facebook and all these people have just come out today having a go at governments about people's privacy. That's a real taking of the biscuit, if ever I heard it, in terms of what they hold on us and how they use it. And, you know, who asked anybody whether people could go around and photograph their house for Google Earth? I'm sure it's a wonderful thing, but I certainly didn't. Anyway, that's by the by. The point I wanted to make was that cybercrime and risk to youngsters is as an important part of training in relation to tablets for schools as the actual physical provision of the equipment. And I hope that as part of this, because it's really a crucial element of it, we can have an integrated, holistic approach that actually makes it possible. I can't resist telling you this little story, because the French have been quite upset with the National Security Agency in the US following the Snowden revelations. Well, it's now 10 years, 11 years, since Nicolas Sarkozy, who was then the Interior Minister, later President of France, came across to, in quotes, negotiate with me about the closure of the Sangatte refugee camp, which was on French soil just outside Calais. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because in order to get the French to close it and to allow our security and immigration staff onto French soil, which was a first, I had to agree to take some of the refugees from Iraq and Afghanistan who'd made their way across Europe. And he said to me, it was dinner at the French embassy the night before, very nice. He said to me, we can cut out the negotiation tomorrow. I said, why is that, Nicola? He said, because I know what your bottom line is. Well, I fell for that one in the past with journalists. They tell you what they think they know, and you tell them what they didn't know until you told them, which is a bit like the Donald Rumsfeld, the known unknowns. So I wasn't going to fall for that. I said, so what is the bottom line? And he told me, and I said, well, you better tell me how you know the number of refugees I'm prepared to take. And he said, because your department don't encrypt your emails to your embassy in Paris, which told me two things. One, the department was way behind the curve on protection and security with technology. And secondly, what we knew all along, which the French were up to espionage right up to their elbows. And I presume they still are. So, stage 3 research, which you've heard about already today, the emergence of the new opportunities because of the charity and the important objectives that you've been discussing, the central feature of putting young people themselves and their future at the core of this, but also actually just to remind ourselves, because I'm doing this piece of work for Tristan Hunt, the new Shadow Secretary, and Ed Miliband on the intermediate tier. What will things look like? How do we structure to avoid the heavy hand of dead bureaucracy and trying to reverse to the past, but at the same time pull schools together and ensure that we have a mutual approach to the future. And in doing that, I've reminded myself over the last month or two, we'll be producing something by March, what is this all about? You know, it's about liberating youngsters from whatever background to have a window on the world. I mean, you can't think of a better example of a window on the world than access to the tablet, to being able to switch on and switch in. You can't think of another device in itself that can be more facilitating, because that's what it is, for teachers to be able to bring about that love of learning, that inquiring mind, that little candle that each and every one of you and your staff have sought to light for students. In other words, not just to raise standards in material terms, critical as that is, but actually also to be able to inspire and enthuse young people to want to go on learning. The best thing I ever wrote was the foreword to the Learning Age Green Paper, which was about lifelong learning. It was about how what we do in the very early years, which is why we invented Sure Start and why we started the first ever national nursery education program, right the way through to adults in retirement. The inspiration of making lifelong learning something that all of us aspire to, so that we can hold on to it and learn something new every day. And you're doing that in schools, and we can do it a lot better if we can engage the youngsters where they're at, the things they're interested in, and with their families, and make it possible for them to feel that they don't have to escape from school and from learning, but that they can feel not just that it's enjoyable, sometimes it isn't because it's damned hard work, but actually that it can be inspirational for them and that they're going to get something out of it. The recent OECD PISA results may have been presented as being dispiriting. I think that they should be a driving force for improvement, but I think they also are a driving force and a challenge for doing it our way. See, lots of politicians who now carry the mantle that I used to have keep talking about Shanghai. I've been to Shanghai. I've sat in classrooms in Shanghai, and I admire what they're doing, but they're doing it within their own culture. I've been to Hong Kong. I didn't actually get into a school in Hong Kong, but they're doing it their own way. The Finnish used to be held up to us. The Swedes used to be held up to us. We've got to find a way of doing things our way, within our culture, and what is right for our schools and our children. And we've got to make it work, because we live in a world of rapid and constant change, which is why, by the way, tablets for schools is such a good idea, because this constant change is happening whether we like it or not. It's taking place around us on a daily basis. The library is now at the touch of the screen. I'm going to get an iPhone. I haven't got one at the moment. I've got something which is out of the arc. It's got buttons on and things. It does something really remarkable. It allows me to speak to people, and it takes answer phone messages. Would you believe that? Absolutely astonishing. I find that most of the people I leave answer phone messages for now never access them because they're waiting for my texts. Anyway, eventually I shall get round to being a real whiz kid on it. At the moment I'm not, but I do know that youngsters really value having that opportunity and being able to reach out and share with each other, which is why the protection for them, the cyber I was mentioning, isn't just protection in relation to criminality, it's also protection of their well-being and their privacy. I say to youngsters who ask me, well, you know, we're a bit interested in politics and citizenship, what's your advice? And apart from telling them to get a life before they get in politics. Because if I'd got a life before I got into politics, I wouldn't have run into quite so much difficulty about 10 years ago, where I decided I'd get a life and it wasn't a good idea, really. Anyway, that's water under the bridge, and things come right. But actually, I also say to them, don't put anything on Facebook. Don't actually send emails and texts that you would not want to be accessed in 20 years' time when you're an up-and-coming politician. And if we still have newspapers with paper in years to come, we'll have found a way of downloading it. So we've got to be really savvy about what we do and how we do it. Right, so it's an integrated approach. It's a holistic approach. It's about books. It's about excellent teaching. It's about world-class leadership. It's about actually being able to get to the youngsters who traditional teaching methods don't reach. I've got a sixth form college in my constituency set up, well, 2 now, that was set up over the last 10 years, which has transformed the staying on rates and the likelihood of youngsters going to university. But they're having to experiment in trying to reach youngsters who have not succeeded well with teaching that they were replicating from the youngsters' school days. So each of us, I think, have got to think about what didn't work at the previous stage, and is there some other way of coming at it? You all know all this anyway, but, you know, David asked me to speak, so you've got to put up with it. But I do think that there's, you know, again, if I'd thought about this when I was teaching and when I was Education Secretary, I might have been a bit more understanding about the need for experimentation and to be able to do what's right for the individual student. So good Wi-Fi for all is a given, okay? I think it's just obvious that we need to do that. We needed electricity in schools that didn't have it in order to be able to do even the most basic things. We needed roofs that didn't leak. Actually, there were quite a lot of roofs leaking. I'll just make this one, just this one party political point. Quite a lot of roofs were leaking in '97, by the way, that aren't leaking now. Just crossing myself. We need to ensure that the basic design of schools, as we improve our schools, as we rebuild our schools, builds in automatically the facility and the ability to be able to do the job well. We might actually be able to save money in terms of the way in which we can use these, rather than the workstations that are obviously quite costly in investment. We need, just to go back to the point I made at the beginning, we need to train everyone well to be able to use the equipment, and we need the support systems in place collectively to be able to make it work. There are all sorts of potential available to be able to do that. In fact, I did a little bit of work with a company that was doing that a few years ago. Sharing best practice is going to be part of this as well, not just sharing data and being able to plagiarize other people's work, but actually also being able to share what's worked in terms of the use of the technology. And the register, I think, will help in people being able to share with each other, so that's good. Perhaps also sharing how to avoid making things a gimmick. There's always a danger with all forms of new technology that it does become a gimmick and something of an add-on rather than an integrated approach to what is happening. And finally, I just want to reflect on my own experience. When I first became a teacher, it was in further education, which is a little bit different to school. I used to engage the students in helping me with presentation. It was obviously a practical way of somebody who couldn't see doing it, but it was also quite interesting in getting students to do it. You had to pick the particular student for the particular task, because when I was on teaching practice, I had a few wags. I don't know, if you've never read Tom Sharp, he died a few months ago, you really ought to read Catch-22 and some of these other books, because it was both entertaining and, in my case, on teaching practice, it was reality that some of the kids in I was not teaching science, you understand, but we were teaching in a laboratory with water and gas taps which were easily switched on. They couldn't understand why I could tell when the gas tap was on. I did explain that my sense of smell hadn't gone. They couldn't understand why I understood that water was flowing about when I could hear it and it was being splashed on boys who were telling them in no uncertain terms to sod off. So we had a bit of a challenge, so we had to choose the students. But I used to get them to write on the board in chalk. Actually, thinking back, I can't guarantee what they wrote. But I used to have to bring my own chalk, by the way, in those days, so things have improved a little bit, I hope. When we moved to overhead projectors, we had to bring bulbs because there was never the bulbs were going all the time. But it was a way of sharing and integrating what the students were doing with what I needed to do. And I think that with tablets for schools, we can do that really effectively and imaginatively. And I think if we get it right, we can make this a massive opportunity for Britain as a whole, for, in this case, schools in England, to be able to be transformational, to leapfrog what's taking place in some of the Asian economies, and to be able to provide that liberation for the individual talent, but also the economy of the future for our country. And if we can get a win-win on that, it will all have been worthwhile. And thank you very much indeed.